Hey everybody, Bill Alcoholic. Good to be back. I hope I can remember what I said last week so I don't repeat myself again. I think I'm supposed to read a paragraph, right? It says here, I believe this is the paragraph we're on. Next, we launched.
Uh, that is correct. 64-1.
Okay. Notice it doesn't say we hesitated for a while. It says next we launched out on a course of vigorous action, the first step of which is a personal house cleaning, which many of us had never attempted. Though our decision was a vital and crucial step, it could have little permanent effect unless at once followed by a strenuous effort to face and be rid of the things in ourselves which had been blocking us. Our liquor was but a symptom, so we had to get down to causes and conditions. So I talked about last week how I did my third step, that I didn't do it when we were reading the book together because my sponsor was afraid I'd come across the table at him. So we were at the roundup, the first annual roundup in '85, South Bay Roundup, and he actually prayed with me around in the hallway behind the roundup. And I think that you can tell how you've done a third step if you start the inventory process, which is what this is talking about. But one of the interesting things it says here, it says liquor was but a symptom. That we had to get down to causes and conditions. There's kind of a bit of an argument about that in AA. Some would feel that liquor is the whole thing, right? And that sometimes we spent too much time doing self-analysis, that there's a spiritual solution, not an intellectual one. But I think there's a way that we arrive at self-knowledge. So a little introspection has some value. One of the things with me when I got here and most of my life prior to that, and a long time in sobriety, I had rage. I was very angry, just pissed off. And there's a history of that in my life of being kicked out of schools and hollering at cops on the side of the road. I would yell at teachers in the classroom in high school, which didn't go over well. And so I was in trouble a lot in my youth. And as I got older, it's hard for me to keep my big mouth shut. Now, one of the things that I discovered in the inventory process is that the rage I had was just masking a lot of fear. And when we say in the third step prayer, please relieve me of the bondage of self, all of that anger and fear and stuff is all self stuff. It's all egoic stuff, to use Eckhart Tolle's term, egoic. I like that. You know, it's all coming from my persona, the persona that I carry around with me. I love what it says in the book too. It says, he wants a certain reputation, but knows he doesn't deserve it. So I was always masking, and not unconsciously masking, wearing a uniform of wanting to be perceived a certain way. I love the next we launched part. Like, I want to be relieved of the bondage of self. How does that happen? How does that happen? I think the first step in that direction is the inventory process. And I think in that sense, the inventory is an extension of the third step. It's the process that's the doorway into self-realization. There's other stuff that comes too. The amends is part of that as well. The amends is what changes our story, the story that we've been telling. And I think the bottom that we hit, when we hit bottom in our drinking, as well as in recovery. There's many bottoms that I've hit in sobriety. You know, is the collapse of the alibi system, the story that I tell that justifies my behavior. The rage that I had, I felt justified in that. You know, I felt I was holding forth. These people are getting away with something, and I've been sent here to let them know that I'm onto them. You know, you can't treat me that way. You can't talk to me that way. You can't, all of that stuff. So I think that this next we launch part is an integral part of the third step that we're reading about. The end result of living a life with seeming power. You know, I have resentment, I have fears, and I have broken sexual relationships. That's what I'm going to list for you. So it says here, our liquor was but a symptom, so we had to get down in causes and conditions. Causes and conditions of what? Is our alcoholism, those causes and conditions, is that what brings about the alcoholism? Is that why I drank? I think there's a debate about that. I think the reason I drank is because when I start drinking, I can't stop. I think there's a physiological aspect to alcoholism that almost anybody can have. It's like you talk to some people, like when I'm sponsoring guys and they tell me that they don't hate their parents. I think that's a requirement to be an alcoholic, is you have to hate your parents. It's kind of mandatory, you know. They're the first ones that interfere with the fear. But I've met people that had really wonderful parents. So what's their goddamn excuse for being an alcoholic, huh? You know, you ever sponsored somebody that you felt like, if I looked like that guy and I was like that guy, I'd be okay. And then you sponsor a guy that looks like you think you'd be okay, and he's all screwed up too. You know, like I thought if I was a real tough guy, instead of a pretend one, because I was a phony tough guy. You know, I had very few fights. I was afraid to fight, you know, but I'm a tough guy and I dressed like a tough guy. I acted like a tough guy. And then I've sponsored some guys that are real tough guys. I mean, real tough guys. The way that they act out, you say the wrong thing, they just knock your ass out, you know? I mean, I was with one of these tough guys and we're leaving the Alano Club going over to Rocky Cola that used to be right next to the Alano Club to have some lunch. And this guy pulled up in front of us in a car on the side street and he almost hit us. And he was in a Mercedes that had the top was open on it, the sunroof. And this guy that I was with yelled at the guy, and the guy yelled back at him. And this guy that I was with reached in through the sunroof and jerked this guy out of his car and slammed him up against the car. I was so impressed. If I could do stuff like that, I'd be fine. I wouldn't be this wimpy little coward dressed like a tough guy. I'd be the real thing and I'd be okay. This guy that I was with is now drinking again. You know, it's like, he's not okay. He's not okay. So these causes and conditions, you know, like if you came from a bad home, you had horrible parents, and dad was a drug dealer, mother was a hooker, you know, there'd be no wonder this guy drinks and he's a drug addict. No wonder. But what about the guy that came from a good home? Some of you might know Matthew Mitchell. I've heard him speak around and stuff. You know, Matthew Mitchell had wonderful parents. There's no rational excuse that Matthew Mitchell should be an alcoholic. You can tell him I said that too. I've told him, I sponsored him for years. And so what are these causes and conditions they're talking about? I don't think the causes and conditions are causes and conditions of our alcoholism. I think we're alcoholic because we're alcoholic. I think the causes and conditions are the emotional problems that I have, the self-centeredness, the emotional immaturity. I think what we all suffer from is emotional immaturity. I don't think we have alcoholic thinking. I'm not a proponent of alcoholic thinking. I think we use alcoholic thinking as an excuse for bad behavior and sobriety. It's like, well, the reason I do that is because I'm an alcoholic. No, the reason you do that is because you're an asshole. You know, it's like, that has nothing to do with alcoholism. You just have a bad personality. You're just not a good guy, you know? I mean, people talk a lot about, forgiving themselves, good luck with that. Sometimes the appropriate emotional response is depression when you realize you're the problem. I don't think there's anything especially negative about that. I mean, I didn't like myself because I was not likable. I wasn't a nice guy. I wasn't a good guy. I don't think that's true anymore. I think I'm a pretty nice guy today. I think I've been transformed, you know. I think the causes and conditions it's talking about are the causes and conditions of my bad behavior, my perception of the world around me, which doesn't have much to do with alcoholism. But I can tell you, you can exacerbate that bad perception by 20 years of really hard drinking and drug use. That'll make it worse, you know? And we use that bad attitude we have as an excuse for our behavior. That's what it's talking about. Now, it wants me to list the resentments, and that's pretty easy for me to do because I think about those people every night when I go to bed. I mean, they take up an immense amount of consciousness. On my first inventory was the entire federal government, and specifically the Department of Motor Vehicles. Who the hell are they to tell me whether I can drive or not, you know? I'm just pissed off, and I feel justified in that pissed offness. And so I list the resentments, but what are we looking for in that resentment list? What are we looking for? We're looking for the fourth column, aren't we? I used to argue with Howard Pollins about whether there was 3 or 4 columns, you know, and Howard's dead now, so I'm going with the fourth column thing. He'll probably come back and haunt me, you know, and there's these Talmudic arguments about the book and how to interpret it, you know, but the fourth column says, if you turn the page, it says, what are my faults and mistakes? And my sponsor in that first inventory brought to my attention that fourth column because there wasn't a whole lot in it, you know. I had a really good first column. I had the list of names and institutions, and I had a good list of the second column, which is why I'm pissed off. It's really clear, and I had good reasoning for being pissed off at those people and those institutions. And the third column, how was I affected by that? Well, mostly it just said I got really angry, but there was a little bit more. I've been to a lot of therapy and mental institutions, so I knew something about self-analysis, so I could see how I'm affected by that. It frightened me, made me feel insecure. But the fourth column, what are my faults and mistakes? When I was a young kid, I wanted to grow my hair long. And this was even pre-hippie days. Everybody used to have their hair squared off in the back and slicked back with jelly rolls. I'm an Elvis Presley 50s kind of a kid. I used to have a jelly roll. I used to have hair. And I had a jelly roll, and you put butch wax in your hair, you know. And then the surfers came around, and all of a sudden I'm peroxiding my hair. You know, it just depends on what persona change I wanted to make. And then your hair almost falls out from the too much peroxide, you know. But I wanted that look, and my parents are depression kids. They thought long hair was kind of a Hollywood thing. They didn't want me to have long hair. And I had arguments. One time I ran away from home. He wanted to take me to the barber, and I ran away from home. And he went and he found me. He took me down to the local barber, and he had the guy shave my head. And the guy said, "Are you sure you want to do this, Mr. Cleveland?" And yes. And I still remember that to this day. And I think that's when I really began hating him with a visceral kind of thing. You know, he was teaching me a lesson. People have always tried to teach me a lesson, right? I remember sitting in front of the boys' vice principal in middle school, and they had brought me in there. I was spitting or I punched somebody or something. And I'm slouched in the chair, and the guy looked at me and he goes, "Sit up straight." And I went, "No." And they called my mother and they took me home, you know. That kind of rage, that kind of anger, you can't talk to me like that. You know, I'm going to retaliate. And there was a lot of retaliation. So one of the things that came in that fourth column, especially ones that I've done since then, is I retaliated. That was a mistake. You know, I don't like authority. And in the 60s, that was a badge of honor to not like authority. I wore that like a badge of honor. You can't talk to me like that. You can't tell me like I will retaliate. And I retaliate, and then things escalate. And so causes and conditions, and when we're getting to this causes and conditions, I can tell you stories about what happened to me that I think caused me to be the way I am. But I think it's deeper than that. I have no idea. There was no reason for me to have that rage. Nobody beat me. Nobody molested me. I don't have that in my life. And in sponsoring a lot of people like I have over the years, you run into people where that kind of stuff happened to them. And it made me realize that I'm just kind of a middle class weenie. I don't know there's no good reason for me to have that rage. My parents basically were two good people, hardworking people. I was an only child. They didn't relate to me too much. They had their own lives. My dad was all busy with his business he was starting. And he was also very involved in Alcoholics Anonymous. He was going to a lot of meetings. And my mother was really involved in Al-Anon. So they were busy. So the worst thing that happened to me is I was neglected a bit, but I wasn't a latchkey kid. I wasn't anything like that. Why was I so angry? What about me that caused me to be so angry? And as I've gone back through the steps and did other third steps and fourth step inventories, I've gotten a little deeper insight into where that might have come from. Not maybe the reason, but just the realization that my perception of the world is not right. I see it as a negative place. And recently, in the last few years since the pandemic, I've had to shut off the TV news. I just wasn't emotionally stable enough to deal with it. I just couldn't deal with it. Doesn't matter what side you're on, it's just insane. And I'm powerless over all of that stuff. And I get sucked into a darkness that's being sold to me through media. And I don't want to live there. I don't want to have that kind of rage and anger. I realize I'm just as polarized as the people I'm angry at, right? And a lot of the negative attention that I got as a kid was as a response to my attitude. So pretty soon you begin to realize that I'm the source of all the chaos in my life. It's easy to look outward and point at those things. Harder to look inward and realize I create this drama in my life. Scott Redmond once told me one time, he said, I really want to help you, but I don't want to be a psychotic participant in what's going on with you. And one of the things about this, and we're kind of jumping into the inventory, but I think it's part of the third step, really, if you want to know, is I screamed at my wife one time. I hope I didn't share this last time, but I screamed at my wife. And she said the wrong thing to me. She said something to me that caused me to scream at her. So you are the reason why I feel the way I do. You're also responsible for how I behave. Because if you didn't say those things or do that, I wouldn't be angry and I wouldn't be retaliating. So you're responsible for how I feel and how I behave. I went to my sponsor and I told him what she said to me that caused me to scream like that. And all he said to me was, stop yelling at your wife. Stop yelling at your wife. So I had to explain it to him again because clearly he didn't hear me, right? Now, the psychotherapists were always interested in how I felt and what I thought about how I felt. You aren't that interested in my explanation for my bad behavior. He just kept repeating, stop yelling at your wife. And in other amends that I've had to make in sobriety were for stuff like that. And his reaction to me, and not just him, has got more people. Bill, you can't talk to people like that. But they said this thing, doesn't matter. You can't talk to people like that. It's not right, And when I respond to you, you'll notice I have a difficulty not cussing, but I'm a lot better than I used to be. You can take the kid out of the street. It's really hard to get the street out of the kid. And when I get excited, I lose all my language skills, and every other word is the F word, you know, preceded by mother. I mean, it's just like, and that's the kind of dialogue you get out of me. Can you count the number of times people have looked at me and just rolled their eyes, sighed deeply, and turned and walked away? Because there's no response to that kind of onslaught. And I'm 6'5", and when I was fat, I was like 280. And so I'm intimidating. I may not be a real tough guy, but it doesn't look good. I loom over people. This is my behavior. One time I went to my sponsor and I said to him, these relationships in AA are just BS, man. There's this illusion of intimacy because we talk about heavy shit, but it's not really real. This is a fabricated thing, and he's looking at me like where's he coming from now, And he would say things to me like, you're really big. So when you're talking to people, try sitting down so you're at eye level with them, and don't stand so close. Don't loom over people, and don't point when you're talking like this. I mean, he actually had this conversation with me, and I listened. It's like, I listened. One time I was out in front of his house and I was having an argument with somebody and I'm pointing at them. He walked up to me and he slapped my hand down and he pushed me back and he said, "You're standing too close." That was humiliating, He humiliated me on many, and I think I needed that. I needed somebody to tell me that. Somebody to tell me that my behavior was bad. I mean, this is causes and conditions, right? I mean, where's this coming from? Where's this anger? Where's this, these later inventories, it became obvious to me that I'm covering up low self-esteem, lack of self-confidence with this loud, blustery behavior. That inside I don't feel worthy, I feel less than, but I'm not the quiet one that hides over in the corner. I'm the one that'll stand up and share twice in a meeting because I have a lot to say. I'm aggressive, I'm loud. I'm that guy. And these are some of the causes and conditions of why I have trouble with personal relationships, The bedevilments, page 52. I have trouble with all of that. I don't get along well, and so this third step, if I'm going to be relieved of the bondage of self, I'm going to be forced to look at some of this stuff. And before I can really institute any change, I have to realize that I am the source of all the turmoil in my life. I am the source. It doesn't mean you're innocent, but if I choose to engage, now it's me. If I'm going to retaliate, that's on me. There was a guy, I was on the board at the South Bay Central office for a long time. And this is a long time ago. And we were doing a fundraiser. And so we were going around selling tickets for something. And one of the guys that was on the board was going around bad mouthing what we were doing. And he's on the board with us, but it comes back to me that this guy's talking about that this whole fundraiser thing is bullshit. We shouldn't be doing it. So I decided that at the next board meeting, I was going to confront this guy. And I thought about it. And I thought real calmly. I said, "This would be an opportunity. I need to learn positive confrontation, how to do it in a positive way, right?" So at the board meeting, I said, "I understand that one of our board members has been bad mouthing what we were doing." And this guy said, "Yeah, that was me." And there was no warning. I just leaned over the thing and said, "Who the F are you to be doing it?" And I just went off on him right in the board meeting, kind of got halfway out of my chair and yelled at him, And so afterwards, I'm leaving the board meeting with one of my buddies that's on the board, Larry. And I said, "What do you think?" And he says, "Well, he really had it coming, but that was awful, Bill." "Well, what do you mean? You just said he had it coming." He goes, "Yeah, but you can't talk to people like that. in the board meeting. What, that's bullshit. He can't do that, you know? And I told my sponsor about it, and he knew the guy that I yelled at, and he laughed and he said, "That, yeah, he is like that." And he says, "Well, when are you going to make amends to him?" I go, "What do you mean make amends? You just told me that he had it coming. It's his fault. He did that. Somebody has to straighten him out." Bill, you can't talk to people like that. You just can't do that. He says, if you're going to make amends, you need to do it in the board meeting in front of everybody, you know? And I had a whole month to think about that, you know? And just fear and trepidation. And you know what happens when you make amends like that? You lose the game. I need to lose the game. I need to realize that I'm not a winner. There's no justification for that kind of behavior. Positive confrontation looks very different. Positive confrontation is with a not yelling, alone one-on-one with the individual and having a conversation about what's going on. Now that's scary. I'd rather humiliate you in front of a group of people. You know, evidently, that's how I behave. So at the next board meeting, I went and I said, I need to say something to the board. I really apologize for my behavior last month. I had no right to speak to you that way in front of everybody. And I looked at the guy and I said, thank you for not punching me in the face. So I think I would have punched me in the face for that. Thank you for not doing that. And he just kind of grinned and nodded his head because he probably thought about it, you know. And I don't think I've done that since. Also, these causes and conditions, behavior traits, aspects of my nature that I wish were different. In my business life, I started treating people with respect. And I've probably made more amends in my business world than almost anywhere else because I'm a boss. People work for me. What are they going to do? You know, I mean, I sign their checks and I would yell at people and berate them. And what you end up with is you're surrounded by a bunch of yes people, not people that can really help you, people that are intimidated and will allow themselves to be that way. Anybody with self-worth would just quit. You know, they wouldn't allow themselves to be treated that way. And I've built a crew around me that's been quite successful over the years as I learned how to grow up, how to be an adult, not a rageful teenager. And I believe when I got to Alcoholics Anonymous at 37 years old, I was a rageful 16-year-old. And this kid was not an honor student. He's the one that's immature, you know. And it's been a long road of change over a couple of decades of learning how to behave correctly through experience, experientially. So the third step, this paragraph, we're talking about getting down to causes and conditions. The inventory is the first step in that direction. And my experience with that is the one I did at 6 months wasn't a very good one, but it was the best I could do. I still have it. I look at it every once in a while. It is pretty good. But at 10 years sober, it was much more thorough. There was much, because I knew, even with all the bad behavior, I knew it was me. By that time, I knew it's not you, it's me. I'm the problem. How I react to things, I have to own that. And I think that's about it. Thanks for letting me share with you.
Thank you.